welcome you to what will be our last study out of Paul's great letter to the church in Philippi in northern Greece. This is the beloved book of Philippians. Thank you for those of you who've been with us just week by week, immersing ourselves in the various kinds of messages that Paul wants to communicate to this church with the underlying theme of joy. Now, as we come to the last section, we actually get to why, one of the reasons why Paul's writing the Philippians is because he's under house arrest in a prison in Rome, and the Philippian church has sent Epaphroditus with supplies. Back in those days, the state didn't provide 3 meals a day or anything for prisoners. They relied on the generosity of people outside the prison to help the prisoner. And so they brought food, probably brought extra blankets, who knows what all they sent to help Paul, and maybe bandages and medical help. They'd sent a man from their church to bring these supplies. And part of the reason Paul's writing this letter is to say thank you to them. And so we're going to pick it up from verse 10 of Philippians chapter 4, and it'll take us down to verse 20. It says, "I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me." So your concern would just be, how's Paul doing? Is he getting enough to eat? Is he surviving prison? Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm a long way from you. I'm in Rome. You're way up there in northern Greece. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, however. He says, "For I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances." And this word content is going to be the driving word behind everything that Paul will say next. He's going to say, thank you, I really appreciate the help, although I do have to tell you that I'm content no matter what. That's a pretty amazing statement to make. Whatever the circumstance, I mean, independent of circumstances, I do want you to know up front that I'm content, whether you'd come through for me or not. I love the story of the 5th century man by the name of Irenaeus. He determined to live a holy life, so he abandoned the conforms of Egyptian society to follow an austere lifestyle in the desert. Yet whenever he visited the great city of Alexandria, there in Egypt, he spent time wandering through its bazaars. I don't know if you ever walked through Middle Eastern bazaars. They're quite the sight, just all kinds of booths with people selling everything you can imagine. He'd wander through the bazaars when he'd come into town, and asked why. He explained that his heart rejoiced at the sight of all the things he didn't need. That's just a kind of a interesting take on contentment, where you see things, you can appreciate them, but you don't really need them. Paul's saying, I appreciate the gifts you've sent me, even though I've learned to be content in spite of them. And this reminds us of what Jesus actually taught. This is very close to the heart of the ethic of Jesus, and it should be the heart of the ethic of all of us who follow him. Jesus said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And we live in a culture, especially in the materialistic West, where there's all kinds of greed everywhere around us. And he warns us. He said, be on your guard against that, because it will redefine life for you. This is what materialism does. It redefines life around objects rather than what's really important. Because life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. It does not consist in the abundance of possession. What defines you as a human being, what brings you value, is not your investment portfolio, it's not your bank account, it's not the furniture in your house, it's not the car you drive. That stuff has nothing to do with either the value or meaning of life. And he says, in a culture full of all kinds of greed, you got to be pretty guarded against this. So that's tough medicine. So let's come back to Philippians 4. He says, I've learned to be content whatever the circumstance. He said, and he's going to unpack this now to really make it clear. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. Now, that's pretty amazing. He said, I've learned to be content. And we learn a couple of things about contentment here. if we unpack them. Let's look at that verse again. First of all, clearly, contentment is what I call a detached satisfaction. I mean, what do I mean by that? I mean, our satisfaction is not attached to the condition of what is around us. He said, whether well-fed or hungry, I live in a way detached. I mean, sometimes I have enough to eat. Sometimes I don't have enough to eat, but my satisfaction is not connected to either. It's disconnected. It's detached from those things. Sometimes I have all I need. Sometimes I'm actually in want. I'm cold. I need a cloak. I don't have a place to stay. But he said those things don't affect who I am or my contentment in life. Wow, we say, I don't know if I could ever be that. Well, Paul also says that this kind of contentment is a learned behavior. Because right there in verse 12, he says, I have learned the secret of being content. And this is a great follow Jesus challenge for every one of our lives. That learning to be less attached to what's around us for our sense of well-being, and yet patient with ourselves that we're going to have to grow into this. He said, over time, I've learned to be content. Contentment is not just a miracle that happens in our lives. It is a learned process, although we have God's help. Because he goes on in the next verse, says, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. We've been studying out of the New International Version. Here's another version that's sometimes a little more familiar to us, the New American Standard, for instance. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Have you heard people say that? If you maybe had a background in the church, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And of course, they're probably thinking about everything else except contentment. Paul says it as applying to contentment. Look, I'm detached. I mean, my welfare isn't dependent on what you do or don't do for me, or what you give or don't give to me, or whether I'm hungry today or I'm not hungry. I have a centered life in Jesus. In his grace, I'm on his mission. His Spirit fills me up. And through him, I can handle it if I don't have enough some days. And through him, I cannot just get too intoxicated with it if I have more than I need. I stay centered. I can stay content. There's just one more thing, though, before we look at a couple of reflective questions. Sometimes we confuse contentment with complacency. I mean, being content, does that mean, well, I just don't care? Or I'm just complacent about things? When I think of complacency, I think of just kind of being lazy and never getting off your couch. No, that's not what contentment is. I sat down and thought about this one day, and it seems to me that complacency, first of all, it has no passion for the mission. I mean, if you're just complacent, you just don't care. Contentment, however, doesn't mean you're still not very passionate about what God's called you to do. It's just that you don't need a lot around you to be a happy camper. Complacency also has no hunger for God. If I'm just complacent, I'm not particularly hungry to seek after God. And complacency has no tolerance for sacrifice, because complacency requires comfort. Sacrifice means sometimes putting aside our comfort. But even though I put aside my comfort, I'm not dependent on comfort to be a whole person, because I am content. So given all of that, maybe we could just stop and reflect here a little bit. And if we were to put you on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is I'm a pretty discontented person. I am not contented right now in my life. Or 10 is I'm a very contented person. I mean, where would you put yourself on that scale? And then it might be worth looking at complacency as well. What helps you overcome complacency in your life? What's keeping you from being complacent but still living in that place of contentment? So here's where Paul now says, thank you. He says in verse 14, picking up the next verse after, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. That's his way of saying thank you. Even though I'm content, I can get by with nothing or with a lot. I mean, my life's not defined by what I possess, just like Jesus said. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. I mean, it does get cold in this prison, and I get hungry sometimes, and you sent me some supplies, and I'm grateful. And he says, moreover, you as Philippians, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance in the gospel, and of course we know that Paul started the church in Philippi, when I set out from Macedonia. So you could picture Greece, present-day Greece. The northern province of present-day Greece was Macedonia. You had Philippi, and then the book of Acts tells us after getting beat up in Philippi, but starting a church, he goes to Thessalonica, then he gets run out of town in Thessalonica, then he goes to Berea, and the Bereans are more open to hearing the gospel. So he's starting to plant churches up there in Macedonia. And then from Berea, he goes down to Athens and Corinth and starts that church in Corinth. So he left Macedonia and he went south. And he said, you know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, so he's going to head south, he said, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you. You're the only ones who just sort of remembered that I may have some practical physical needs. And in this, and I love this phrase, this matter of giving and receiving, because the matter of giving and receiving is really an essential part of the Christian life. We learn to be content no matter what we have or don't have, but we're also passionate about following the Jesus who gave his life for us, the God of generosity to us. And so giving and receiving becomes a part of our lives. In fact, Jesus said, don't lay up treasures for yourself on earth, but lay them up in heaven. How do we do that? By giving. Jesus said, you can't make money and God both your gods at the same time. Money has almost godlike status to determine your security and your welfare and to determine your value in life. Money is like a false god. It's a competing god, and you've got to choose between them. But when you engage a life of giving and receiving, and it's not just giving, it's receiving too, it's being a part of a community. When you learn to do this, you are laying up treasures in heaven, and you are defying money's power over your life. And he said, only you only were the ones who were the first to start helping me in this matter of giving and receiving. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need. I mean, even before I left Macedonia, more than once you sent me aid. And this is part of the reason he writes this letter, to thank them. But he goes on, he's just going to unpack the power of giving just a little bit more. Not that I desire your gifts. Remember, he says, I'm content. But what I really desire is that more be credited to your account, to your eternal account. Laying up treasures in heaven. How do we do that? When we're willing to give away things that we feel entitled to or we may own as our own possessions, and we just give them away. Money that we could keep for ourselves, we just give it away. You're building up treasure in heaven. And so this, your account is your heavenly account. And not one thing we give is ever missed by God. Everything we let go of here is added to our heavenly account and our heavenly rewards. I have received full payment, and I have more than enough. I'm amply supplied now that I've received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. He's saying thank you. But he's also saying they are a fragrant offering and an acceptable sacrifice that pleases God. In other words, it's an act of worship to God himself. Isn't that something? That when you give your money to support a missionary, when you pay your tithes to support your church, when you let go of things that you could keep for yourself, God receives it as a sacrifice. And, he said, my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory. So he receives it as a sacrifice of worship to him, and it opens the doors for the provision of God. I want to say that to you clearly today. My God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. So if we just summarize what Paul said in the previous few verses, generosity nurtures a sacrificial spirit within us. It defies the power of money to become our God. It is received by the Lord as an act of worship. What you give to others is received by the Lord as worship, and it invites God's supply back into our lives. And so, what else could Paul say? But to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. So that just leaves us with the questions, first of all, how might generosity and contentment be related? I'd like you to think that through. And then, my God will supply all your needs. So where would you like prayer for God's supply in some areas of your life as you on your part give yourself to generosity? And so ends the letter to the Philippians. And God bless you, and may his generosity just pour towards you in abundant ways.